The officer's voice cut through the courtroom's silence like a whip. Sharp and commanding, his boots stomped against the polished marble floor, each step echoing with the weight of unchecked authority. His presence was large, menacing, and everything about his stance, the way his hand hovered dangerously close to his holster, his fingers twitching in anticipation, made it clear that he had already decided she was a threat. But the woman behind the judge's desk didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the storm of aggression barreling toward her. She continued flipping through the legal documents in front of her, her movements calm, deliberate, as if she hadn't just been ordered by a man who believed he controlled the very air in this room. Officer David Langley wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone like her. His jaw tightened, breath leaving him in an irritated huff. "Did you not hear me?" he barked, his patience already running thin. "I said get up. This is a restricted area. And you have no business sitting in that chair. Move, now." The woman exhaled slowly, as if contemplating whether this moment even deserved her attention. She took her time, lifting her gaze from the paperwork and meeting his stare with a look so steady, so unyielding, it made his skin prickle. There was something about the absolute lack of fear in her eyes that unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. "And you are?" Her voice was smooth, controlled, like she had all the time in the world. David let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, his lips twisting into something cruel. "I'm the one who's about to throw you out of here if you don't move," he sneered, stepping closer, his imposing figure looming over her. The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Throw me out?" she repeated, as if the very thought amused her. But her eyes, they told a different story. There was no humor there, only something that made David's irritation flare into anger, hot, unchecked, dangerous. "Don't act dumb with me," he snapped, his temper rising. "You don't belong here. I don't know how you got in, but I know damn well you aren't supposed to be sitting in that chair, messing with court documents like you have authority here. Now, I'm telling you one last time, get up, or I will remove you myself." The woman still didn't move, still didn't blink. That was all the justification David needed. His patience had officially run out. With one swift, forceful motion, he lunged forward and grabbed her arm, yanking her up from the chair with unnecessary force. She stumbled slightly from the suddenness of it, but still, she didn't resist, didn't struggle, didn't cry out. David dragged her toward the door, his grip tightening around her as if she were a criminal caught in the act. His breath came hard and fast, his heart pounding with self-righteous adrenaline. "You people," he muttered under his breath, the disgust in his voice unmistakable. "Think you can just walk in anywhere you want, take what you want, do whatever you want?" The courtroom doors slammed open. The sound echoed like a gunshot, snapping the tension in the air. A woman stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, her expression frozen in shock. "What the hell is going on in here?" The court clerk's voice rang through the chamber, filled with alarm. Her gaze darted frantically between David and the woman he still held onto with iron-like fingers. David barely spared the clerk a glance. He was too locked in his own sense of righteousness to consider that he might be in the wrong. He jerked his chin toward the judge's bench, still gripping the woman's arm. "I caught her behind the judge's desk," he said with absolute certainty, as if he had just uncovered some great crime. "Snooping through files. God knows why. She's probably trying to steal something. Or..." The woman let out a slow, measured breath, as if this entire scene was beneath her. Then, without urgency, she reached into the inner pocket of her blazer. David stiffened immediately, his grip on her turned painful, his fingers digging into her skin, his entire body tensed, instincts kicking in. "Don't even think about it," he warned, his voice low, dangerous. But what she pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was something far more powerful. A badge. A judge's badge. It gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Small but undeniable, a symbol of authority. Her authority. The same name engraved outside the courtroom in golden letters. The presiding judge of this court. Judge Naomi Carter. The breath hitched in David's throat. His entire body went rigid. His fingers uncurled instantly, as if her skin had burned him the second he realized what he had done. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating, pressing down on his chest like an unbearable weight. Naomi moved with practiced ease, brushing off her blazer as if nothing had happened. Then she looked at him again. This time, Her eyes weren't just calm, they were something else entirely. Something final. You just put your hands on a sitting judge. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't angry. It was fact. Unforgiving. Absolute. David felt his stomach drop into an endless abyss. His hands trembled slightly. Barely perceptible, but she saw. She saw everything. His breathing was shallow, coming out in uneven bursts. His heart was pounding so hard. It drowned out the silence in his ears. The weight of what he had just done crashed down on him. And for the first time in his life, Officer David Langley realized something terrifying. He had no power here. The power belonged to her. And what happened next left everyone in shock. Hey, family, here at Tales of Reckoning, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in all its forms. Speech balloon, what do you think? Drop a comment below. Can someone like David ever redeem himself? Or did he get exactly what he deserved? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this. Your support helps us expose the truth, celebrate resilience, and demand justice. Remember, these stories are more than just entertainment. They are lessons, they are warnings, and they are calls to action. Until next time, stay strong, stay aware, and never stop speaking up. The Montgomery County Courthouse stood like an unshaken monument to tradition, its grand marble pillars casting long shadows over the streets below. The building, soaked in history, had seen victories, injustices, and reckonings, each moment leaving an invisible scar on the walls. And today, another reckoning was about to unfold. Inside one of its many courtrooms, Judge Aaliyah Carter sat in the very seat of authority she had earned through a lifetime of resilience. The weight of the law rested in her hands, a weight that many before her had abused, ignored, or twisted, but not her. She was different. She had fought, bled, and sacrificed for this position. She had endured the whispers, the doubt, the barriers placed in her path simply because of her skin color, her gender, her presence in a space she was never meant to reach. And yet, she had arrived. She had broken through the doors that were never meant to open for her. And today, she would prove exactly why she deserved to be here. But fate had a cruel way of testing even the strongest souls. Today, her authority, her existence, would be questioned in the most demeaning way possible, by a man who had never questioned himself a day in his life. Officer Greg Millstone was not a man who doubted his instincts. He didn't second guess. He didn't hesitate. Because in his world, hesitation meant weakness. For 19 years, he had walked these halls with the confidence of a man who believed in his own untouchable power. He wasn't just a police officer, he was a gatekeeper. He decided who belonged, who was a threat, who deserved to be removed. And in his mind, there was no doubt about what he saw when he entered that courtroom. A black woman, sitting behind the judge's desk, sifting through files like she owned the place. Greg's training, his experience, his biases, all converged into a single, unshakable decision. She wasn't supposed to be there. He had seen it before, people sneaking where they didn't belong, pretending to be more than they were. And his job, his duty, was to stop them. So he didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He acted. Ma'am, step away from that desk right now. His voice slammed into the silence. Commanding, sharp, the sound of authority filling the space like a bullet cutting through the air. But she didn't move, didn't even acknowledge him. That alone was enough to set his blood on fire. How dare she ignore him? I said get up. Still, nothing. Greg took a step forward, his hand hovering dangerously close to his holster. His fingers twitched, his muscles tightened. He was ready for a confrontation. Finally, the woman lifted her head. When their eyes met, something cold and unsettling wrapped around Greg's spine. There was no fear in her gaze. No panic. Only something far more dangerous. Certainty. And you are? She asked. Her voice smooth, composed, controlled. Greg's nostrils flared. I'm the one who's about to throw you out of here if you don't move. He snapped, stepping closer. Her head tilted slightly. Throw me out? The lack of fear, the quiet defiance in her tone, made his temper snap like a rope pulled too tight. I don't know how you got in here, but you don't belong, and I will remove you myself if I have to. Then, he grabbed her, his fingers closed around her arm, yanking her out of the chair with unnecessary force. She stumbled slightly from the brutality of his grip. But she didn't fight, didn't struggle, didn't break. He started dragging her toward the door, his grip tightening, his heart hammering in his chest, the high of power flooding his veins. She was nothing, a nobody pretending to be someone, and he was about to put her in her place. Then, the courtroom doors slammed open. What the hell is going on in here? The court clerk stood in the doorway, her face drained of color, her eyes flicking between Greg and the woman he had manhandled like a criminal. Greg barely looked at her. "I caught her behind the judge's desk," he said with absolute certainty, as if he had just uncovered a conspiracy. "Probably trying to steal something." Or, the woman sighed, a slow, measured, almost bored exhale. And then, she reached into her inner pocket. Greg froze. His grip tightened, fingers digging into her flesh. His mind screamed at him to be ready. To act, to protect himself. "Don't even think about it," he snapped. Then, she pulled it out. A badge. Not a police badge. Not a lawyer's badge. A judge's badge. And the name on it? Judge Aaliyah Carter. Greg's lungs forgot how to breathe. His world cracked apart like shattered glass. His fingers instantly uncurled, releasing her as if he had been burned. Aaliyah straightened her blazer. Calm, unshaken, unforgiving. She lifted her eyes back to his. "You just put your hands on a sitting judge." Greg's stomach plummeted into an abyss. His hands trembled. His heart roared in his ears. The weight of what he had done, of what he had destroyed in mere seconds, crushed down on him like a mountain collapsing. For the first time in his life, Officer Greg Millstone felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Fear. And he wasn't the one in control anymore. Not even close. And what happened next left the entire courtroom in shock. Hey family. Here at Tales of Reckoning, we expose the truth, demand justice, and celebrate resilience. What do you think? Drop a comment below. Did Greg deserve what happened to him? Can someone like him ever truly change? Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Your support helps us tell more powerful, eye-opening stories like this one. And remember, real justice doesn't happen overnight. It happens when we speak up, stand firm, and never stop demanding better. Stay strong, stay aware, and until next time, keep fighting for what's right. The weight of the door closing behind Officer Greg Millstone was deafening. The sound of finality, of everything he had built crumbling in a single moment. He had walked out of that courtroom, but it didn't feel like he had left. The echoes of what had happened followed him, clung to his skin like a second shadow. Suffocating, inescapable. For 19 years, Greg had been a man of authority. A police officer who commanded respect. Someone people obeyed without question. His uniform wasn't just fabric, it was armor. His badge wasn't just metal, it was his power. But today, he had lost everything. He could still hear her voice. Sharp and deliberate, like a gavel coming down on his fate. You just put your hands on a sitting judge. Judge Aaliyah Carter hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. Her calm certainty had sliced through him deeper than any shouted accusation. And now, he was walking down the courthouse hallway, his steps foreign and heavy, the same way the criminals he had once escorted must have felt. Powerless, disgraced, forgotten. Except Greg wasn't just any officer. He had believed himself untouchable. Until today, his heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out the murmurs in the hallway, the whispers of court staff, of clerks, of people who had seen what had happened. They knew, they all knew, and their eyes, those watching, pitying, judging eyes, burned into him. His world had changed in seconds, but the realization of it had not yet fully hit him. Not until he reached the doors of the courthouse. Not until he saw the crowd gathered outside. Not until he saw reporters, cameras, and his wife, Dana. The moment his gaze landed on her, his stomach twisted. She stood there, rigid, arms crossed so tightly over her chest it looked like she was holding herself together. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were different. She had looked at him with love once. Now, she looked at him like she didn't recognize him at all. Greg wanted to turn back, wanted to run, but there was nowhere left to go. Instead, he walked toward her, every step a lifetime of mistakes catching up to him. She didn't speak at first, didn't move. She just stood there, waiting. Finally, when he was close enough to touch her, she spoke. What did you do? Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. But it was worse than anger. It was disappointment. Greg swallowed hard. His throat felt tight. His mouth dry. Dana, don't. She cut him off, her arms tightening. Don't feed me some excuse. Don't stand here and try to spin it. You put your hands on a judge? Greg exhaled slowly. I didn't know. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, blending into the soft murmurs of passengers settling into their seats. The smell of coffee and recycled air was thick, a familiar scent of travel. Flight 227 was fully booked. Bodies pressed together in two small spaces. Strangers forced into uncomfortable proximity. Among them, Detective Thomas Carter sat quietly, his 6-foot frame folded into the narrow economy class seat, his expression unreadable. His hands rested on his lap, fingers interlaced in a practiced calm. The years spent in law enforcement, seeing the best and worst of humanity, had trained him to maintain control over his emotions, to let insults slide, to let ignorance burn out on its own. But even with his years of discipline, even with his patience carved into steel, he felt her eyes on him. A few rows ahead, Karen Whitmore, a wealthy, privileged woman in her mid-50s, was watching him. No, staring at him. Her posture was stiff, her lips pressed together in a thin line of disapproval, her gaze filled with something sharp, something cruel. Thomas had encountered that look before. It was the look of entitlement, of assumption, of a person who had never been told no, who believed the world was a space built exclusively for them. He had seen it before in traffic stops, in courtrooms, in neighborhoods where people didn't think he belonged. And now? He was seeing it at 35,000 feet. Karen's whispers started small, a subtle shake of her head, a muttered complaint to the flight attendant, a too loud, I just don't feel comfortable sitting near certain people. Her voice carried, but no one challenged her. Thomas exhaled slowly, staring out the window, pretending not to notice, pretending not to care. But he cared, because he always knew how this story ended, because he had seen it play out too many times. Karen didn't stop there. She called over the flight attendant, a young woman who looked nervous, and gestured toward Thomas with a tight, forced smile. Excuse me, miss, but I believe I was seated next to the wrong person. The flight attendant blinked, confused, embarrassed. I'm sorry, ma'am? Karen lowered her voice, but not enough. I don't feel safe sitting next to him. Safe. The word hit like a slap. But Thomas didn't react. He kept his gaze fixed on the window, his heartbeat steady, his expression locked in place. But inside, he was tired. Tired of this dance. Tired of having to prove he belonged. To prove his innocence before he was ever accused of anything. The flight attendant hesitated, her eyes darting to Thomas, then back to Karen. Ma'am, this is your assigned seat. Karen sighed dramatically, as if she were the victim in all of this. I just think it would be better for everyone if I moved. Or if he moved. Thomas closed his eyes for a brief second, inhaling through his nose. He could already hear the murmurs of other passengers. Some watching with curiosity. Some pretending not to see what was happening. Some, perhaps, agreeing with Karen in silence. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if searching for an escape. Thomas decided to make it easy for her. He unbuckled his seatbelt, shifting slightly, his deep voice calm and steady. You can put her somewhere else. I'm not moving. Karen's eyes widened, her face twisting with something ugly. Excuse me? I paid for this seat, Thomas said simply, finally looking at her, his dark eyes meeting hers head-on. And I'm going to stay in it. The tension crackled in the air. Karen's face flushed red, her lips parting in outrage, her voice rising in volume. I don't have to put up with this. I will not be forced to sit next to someone like. A loud beep interrupted her. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their final preparations for departure. The flight attendant seized the opportunity. Ma'am, we need to take off now. If you're uncomfortable, I can ask if there are any open seats. But we cannot make other passengers move. Karen's jaw clenched. She looked at Thomas, then back at the flight attendant. Then, with a huff of exasperation, she plopped back into her seat with exaggerated frustration. Her body turned sharply away from him, as if he carried disease. The moment settled. The whispers died down. But the shame? The humiliation? That lingered. Not for Karen. For him. Because he had been through this before. Because he knew that no matter what he did, whether he spoke, whether he remained silent, whether he stood his ground, whether he walked away, he would always be the villain in her story. The flight took off, climbing into the sky, but Thomas sat rigid and unmoving, his eyes locked on the clouds outside, his body carrying the weight of something heavier than gravity itself. Then, 2 hours into the flight, the turbulence hit. A sharp jolt shook the plane, sending trays clattering, drink cups toppling over. Passengers gasped. Karen let out a small shriek, clutching the armrest, and then, she reached out for him. The instinct was automatic. A moment of fear, a moment where her body reacted before her mind could stop her. Her fingers grabbed his arm, gripping tight, the raw panic overtaking her prejudice. Thomas turned. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she saw him. Not a threat, not a danger, not someone who didn't belong. Just a person. For a fleeting second, the hatred, the superiority, the privilege, it all faded. But then, reality came crashing back. Karen snatched her hand away as if burned. Her face turned red again, but for an entirely different reason. Shame. She opened her mouth, searching for something to say, but Thomas had already turned away. Because at that moment, he realized, he didn't need an apology. He didn't need her to admit she was wrong. She knew, and she would have to live with that. The turbulence passed. The rest of the flight went on in silence. But in the quiet, in the space where words had once been spoken so recklessly, there was now only one truth. She would remember this moment for the rest of her life. And maybe next time, she would think before she spoke. Maybe next time, she wouldn't let her fear create enemies where there were none. Or maybe people like her would never change. And Thomas Carter had long stopped waiting for them to. Didn't know? Dana's voice rose slightly, emotion finally breaking through. You mean you didn't stop to find out? You assumed. You grabbed her. You humiliated her in her own courtroom. Greg flinched. Because it was true. Because no justification, no apology, no regret could erase what had happened. You realize, Dana continued, her voice quieter now, what this means for Ethan, don't you? Greg's chest tightened painfully. His son, 15-year-old Ethan, who had once looked up to him, who had defended him against anyone who spoke against the police. Ethan, who would have to walk into school tomorrow and hear his father's name dragged through the mud. Ethan, who would have to face the consequences of Greg's mistake just as much as he would. Greg opened his mouth to say something, anything, but Dana was already turning away. Don't come home tonight, she said. I need time. Ethan needs time. And then she was gone. Greg stood there, rooted to the spot, the city moving around him, moving on, while he stood still, left behind. A bitter laugh bubbled up in his chest. For 19 years, he had been the one telling people to walk away. Now, it was him being left behind. The drive home felt like a funeral procession. His hands gripped the wheel tightly. His jaw locked, the courthouse growing smaller in the rearview mirror. But the weight of what had happened only growing heavier. His badge, his gun, his job, gone. And soon, his family, too. His home felt different when he stepped inside. The silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive. It was the sound of a life unraveling. Greg sat on the couch, staring at nothing. For the first time in his life, he had nowhere to go. Nothing to do. He had spent years defining himself by his job, by his badge, by his ability to control others. Now, he was just a man with nothing left. A knock at the door startled him. Greg hesitated before standing, dragging his feet toward the door like a man walking to his own execution. He wasn't sure who he expected. But he never expected her. Judge Aaliyah Carter stood on his porch, her expression unreadable. Greg felt his stomach drop. He gripped the doorframe tightly. Like if he let go, he might collapse. Are you going to let me in? Her voice was calm. Greg hesitated too long. That wasn't a request, she added. He stepped aside. She entered, her presence commanding, as if even in his home, he had no control. You look like hell, she noted. Greg let out a short, bitter laugh. Yeah, well, it's been a rough day. Aaliyah didn't smile. Good. Greg flinched. She studied him for a long moment. You spent 19 years making snap decisions, she said. You never questioned them, never thought about the lives they affected. But now? She tilted her head. Now, You finally feel it, don't you? Greg swallowed hard. I lost everything today, he admitted. Aaliyah nodded. You lost a job, a title, a badge, but that's not everything. Greg. Her gaze pierced through him. Tell me, when was the last time you stopped and questioned if you were wrong? Greg opened his mouth. No words came out. Because the truth was painful. Because the answer was never. Aaliyah exhaled, shaking her head slightly. I'm not here to punish you. Greg, life's already doing that, but you need to understand something. This isn't just about you. This is about every person you've ever treated the way you treated me today. And every one of them? She leaned in slightly. They didn't have a badge to protect them. Greg felt something crack inside him. For the first time, he saw himself the way others had seen him for years. A bully. A man who used power. Not justice. And now? Now, he had nothing. What happens next is up to you. Aaliyah said, stepping toward the door. But I hope, for your sake, you actually start thinking before you act. Then she was gone. And Greg stood there, staring at the empty space where she had been. For 19 years, he had thought himself the man who delivered consequences. Today, he had learned what it meant to face them himself. And maybe it was only the beginning. They're not just stories. They're warnings. They're truths. And sometimes, they're reality. The summer sun burned hot over the grocery store parking lot. Its unforgiving heat radiating off the asphalt in shimmering waves. The air was thick, suffocating, heavy with the scent of fuel and melting pavement. It was the kind of day that made tempers short and patience thinner than a thread. Michael Jennings wasn't in a rush. He wasn't the kind of man who rushed anywhere. He moved through life with purpose. With calm. With the kind of unshakable presence that made people notice him, whether they wanted to or not. At 6 feet tall, with a muscular build and an air of quiet confidence. He was the kind of man who turned heads, not just because of his looks, but because of the power he carried within him. He had just finished loading his groceries into the back of his car when he heard it. The sharp, clipped voice of Karen Thompson. It was the kind of voice that cut through the air, grating and entitled. The kind that expected instant obedience from the world around it. You're in my spot. Michael barely turned, his fingers still gripping the shopping cart. Excuse me? He said. His voice even, steady. Karen huffed, stepping closer, her designer heels clicking against the pavement like the countdown to a bomb about to explode. She was in her late 50s, dressed in an expensive summer blouse, her blonde hair perfectly styled, oversized sunglasses perched atop her head. She looked like someone who had spent her entire life getting what she wanted. And today, what she wanted was for Michael to move. I said, you're in my spot, she repeated, waving a manicured hand at the parking space where Michael's car sat. Doors shut, groceries secured. I always park here, every time I come to this store. It's my spot. Michael let out a slow breath. He had lived this moment before. Not this exact one, not this exact woman, but the same kind of confrontation. The same kind of entitlement. The same kind of person who believed that his presence was somehow an intrusion. It was always something. He wasn't where he was supposed to be. He wasn't who they expected him to be. And somehow, that was always a problem. Ma'am, he said carefully, I don't see your name on the space. First come, first served. Karen's face twisted, her disbelief morphing into pure offense. Oh, how typical, she spat, folding her arms. You people always think you can just take whatever you want. Michael stilled. The phrase sank into his skin like poison. But he didn't react. Not yet. Karen took his silence as permission to continue. You have no respect, she snapped, stepping closer. No manners. Just taking up space where you don't belong. I don't care who you think you are. You need to move your damn car before I call the police. Michael clenched his jaw. The heat of the sun had nothing on the heat rising in his chest. He had never been a man to back down. But he had also never been a fool. He had seen how these situations played out. A woman like Karen wasn't afraid of him. She was counting on everyone else being afraid of him. She wanted a scene. She wanted an audience. She wanted him to react. To lose control. To become the villain in her story. And for a moment, he thought about walking away. He thought about shaking his head. Getting in his car. Driving home. And forgetting about her like a bad dream that didn't matter. But then, Karen slapped him. The impact cracked through the air. A sharp, humiliating sound that made heads turn. Made people stop mid-stride. made the entire parking lot hold its breath. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, Michael moved. Not away. Not backward. Forward. His shoulders squared. His chest expanding with the force of everything he had ever held back. Every insult he had ever ignored. Every moment he had swallowed his pride to keep the peace. His hand shot up, and he slapped her back. The sound was louder than hers. Deeper. Final. Karen staggered, her sunglasses tumbling off her face. Her hands flying to her cheek as if she had just been struck by lightning itself. She looked at him, stunned, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Michael didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't back down. "Now we're even," he said, his voice low, steady. "You put your hands on me. I put my hands on you. Doesn't feel too good, does it?" Karen sputtered, her rage morphing into something uglier, fear. She turned to the gathering crowd, searching for sympathy, for outrage, for someone to come to her defense. But the world had changed. And the people watching? They had seen everything. Someone had their phone out, recording. Someone else laughed under their breath. Karen's power, her privilege, the assumed safety of her actions, had vanished in an instant. She was just a woman who had picked the wrong person to attack. And she knew it. Her lips quivered. Her pride broke. You're going to regret this," she hissed, her voice shaking. Michael lifted his chin. "No, Karen," he said, "you are." She spun on her heel, storming toward her car, throwing the door open so hard it almost bounced back at her. Her hands shook as she fumbled with her keys. Michael turned to the crowd, locking eyes with the man holding up his phone. "Make sure you got all of that," he said, his voice calm. The man grinned. "Oh, don't worry, brother. The world's gonna see it all." Michael nodded, his pulse finally slowing, the adrenaline fading. And as he turned back to his own car, as he climbed in, as he shut the door and took a deep breath, he realized, for the first time in his life, when faced with this kind of moment, he didn't swallow it down. He didn't let it fester in his chest. He didn't let her win. And damn, did that feel good. The night air was thick, humid, wrapping around Eleanor Davis like an unwelcome second skin. The dim glow of the streetlights barely cut through the darkness, casting long, shifting shadows against the cracked pavement. She walked steadily, her footsteps even, measured, purposeful. Beside her, Duke, a massive Rottweiler with a coat as black as midnight, moved in perfect sync with her. They had walked this path 100 times before, and tonight should have been no different. But Eleanor could feel it. That creeping sensation, the hairs rising on the back of her neck, the faint echo of footsteps behind her. She didn't turn her head. She didn't quicken her pace. She had learned long ago that showing fear only made them bolder. Instead, she gave a sharp, subtle tug on Duke's leash. The dog understood immediately, his ears flicking back, his steps shifting just slightly, his large, muscular frame angling between Eleanor and whoever was behind them. She reached the edge of the park, where the streetlights faded, swallowed by the thick trees ahead. Then, a voice, low, mocking, "Too close. Where you headed, sweetheart?" Eleanor exhaled slowly, coming to a stop. She didn't need to turn around to know there were more than one of them. She could hear it, the shuffle of feet, the low chuckle, the stale scent of cigarette smoke and cheap beer clinging to the air. She glanced at Duke. His body had gone rigid, his muscles coiled like a spring, his massive head slightly lowered, his dark eyes locked forward, watching, waiting. "That's a nice dog you got there," another voice added. "Big, strong, but I bet even he can't save you." The laughter that followed made Eleanor's stomach tighten. Her fingers curled into Duke's leash. But not in fear, in control. They had no idea what they were walking into. Slowly, she turned. There were 3 of them. Men, smirking, arrogant, confident in their numbers, their size, their presumed power. The one in the center, Brian Tanner, a face she recognized too well from around the neighborhood, took a step closer. His hands stuffed into his pockets, his head tilting in mock curiosity. "You ain't scared, huh?" he said. Most women would be shaking by now. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Most women don't have Duke." Brian's smirk twitched, his gaze flicking to the dog. Duke hadn't moved, but the sheer weight of his presence had shifted the air around them. The other 2 men exchanged a glance. They could feel it too. Something about this wasn't going the way they expected. Brian's smile returned, but there was a nervous edge to it now. "He's just a dog," he said, though it sounded more like a reassurance to himself than an insult to Duke. Eleanor finally let the silence stretch. Then, she spoke, soft, controlled, deadly. "Duke, sit." The command was simple. And yet, the air cracked with tension as the massive Rottweiler dropped onto his haunches without breaking eye contact with Brian. The leash went slack in Eleanor's hand. Brian swallowed. "Lady, we don't want no trouble." "That's good," she interrupted, her voice cutting clean through his excuse. "Because you don't want to know what happens when Duke stands back up." The silence was deafening. For the first time, the men hesitated. They weren't in control anymore. They weren't calling the shots. And they knew it. Brian took a step back. His smile completely gone. The other two followed, their previous bravado crumbling under the weight of Duke's stare. They left. Quick, quiet, and Eleanor let them. Because the best victories aren't always loud. She didn't report it. She didn't need to. The neighborhood talked, and word traveled faster than any police report ever could. By morning, everyone knew what had happened. And more importantly, they knew what had almost happened. They knew that Eleanor Davis had stood her ground. That Duke had protected her without lifting a paw. And that Brian Tanner and his crew had walked away with their pride hanging by a thread. But the story didn't end there. Because the world doesn't let women like Eleanor walk away without consequences. 3 days later, they came back. This time, they weren't looking to scare her. This time, they were looking for revenge. It happened in the middle of the day. Broad daylight. She was walking home from the corner store when a car pulled up alongside her. Slow and deliberate. She knew before the window even rolled down. Brian. His smile was back, but now it was twisted. "Shoulda kept your mouth shut." "Lady," he said. Eleanor didn't stop walking. Didn't acknowledge him. She just reached into her bag, wrapping her fingers around the canister of pepper spray she had carried for years. But Brian was faster. The car door swung open. 2 of them jumped out. Eleanor barely had time to react before they grabbed her. Duke wasn't with her this time. And for the first time in years, she felt fear. Hands tightened on her arms, dragging her toward the car. She struggled, fought, but they were stronger. She screamed, once, loud, desperate, but the street was empty. And no one came. Then, a growl, low, rumbling, like thunder before a storm. Then another, louder, sharper, closer. Duke. The Rottweiler came tearing around the corner. His entire body a blur of power and rage. His teeth bared, his eyes locked onto them, his paws hitting the ground like gunfire. The men barely had time to react. Duke was on them before they could even think to run. One of them let go of Eleanor just in time to get slammed into the pavement. The other turned to flee. But Duke lunged, snapping his powerful jaws inches from his arm. Brian scrambled backward, falling onto the sidewalk. Duke didn't bite, didn't attack, but he didn't have to. The sheer force of his presence, the raw power behind his growl, was enough. The men ran. Brian stumbled after them, nearly tripping over himself as he bolted for the car. And then, it was over. Eleanor was shaking, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. Duke stood beside her, his body still tense, his ears still perked, watching until the car disappeared down the street. Then, slowly, he turned his head, checking on her, making sure she was okay. She dropped to her knees, wrapped her arms around him, buried her face in his fur. And for the first time in a long, long time, she let herself cry. The courtroom was silent. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air, pressing against every person in attendance like an unseen force. The judge's gavel had yet to fall, but the verdict had already been delivered in the unspoken energy of the room. Greg Millstone sat at the defendant's table. His once proud shoulders slumped under the crushing realization that this was his moment of reckoning. He wasn't the enforcer anymore. He was the one being judged. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 19 years, he had worn his badge like armor, believing that it gave him the power to determine who was guilty, who deserved punishment, and who was worthy of second chances. But today, the world saw him for what he truly was. A man who had abused his power. A man who had believed himself untouchable. A man who had finally met the limits of his authority. The judge, Aaliyah Carter, sat at the bench, her expression unreadable, but Greg could feel the weight of her eyes on him, holding him there, pinning him down with the sheer force of her presence. "Officer Millstone," she said finally, her voice steady, unwavering, "you were given a responsibility. You were trusted to uphold the law with integrity. And yet, when faced with a situation that challenged your assumptions, you didn't pause, you didn't question, you acted with force, with arrogance, with the absolute belief that you had the right to decide who did and did not belong." Greg swallowed hard. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to say he had made a mistake, that he wasn't a bad man, that this wasn't who he was. But the truth sat like a stone in his throat. Because he knew, this was exactly who he had been. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, folding her hands together. "For years, people like me have had to walk into rooms knowing that people like you would never see us as equals. We have been arrested for crimes we didn't commit. We have been accused, judged, sentenced, without a second thought." She exhaled sharply, her gaze cutting into him. "And now, Officer Millstone, for the first time in your life, you know what it feels like to be on the other side of that power." Greg closed his eyes briefly, his hands clenching into fists on his lap. Because she was right. Because for the first time in his life, he felt small. And the worst part? He had done this to himself. The judge let the silence stretch before she finally spoke again. "This is what accountability looks like." The gavel fell. The sound echoed through the room. Final and absolute. Greg's life fell apart quickly after that. The department didn't just fire him, they erased him. His name was dragged through the media. His once respected reputation reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. He lost his pension. He lost his friends on the force. But worst of all, he lost his family. Dana left. She packed her bags and took Ethan with her. "I defended you for years," she told him, her voice thick with anger and betrayal. "I told people you were a good man. But now, I don't even know who you are." Greg had begged her to stay. But the damage was done. He had spent so long believing that he was the one with power, that he was the one who controlled his fate. And now, he had nothing left to hold on to. For weeks, Greg barely left his house. He avoided the news, avoided the looks from people who had once called him a hero, avoided the man in the mirror, because he couldn't stand to see the truth staring back at him. But then, Ethan came back, not for long, just for a few minutes. Enough to stand in the doorway, looking at his father like he was searching for something, some small piece of the man he had once admired. "Do you regret it?" Ethan asked. Greg's chest tightened painfully. "Every second," he admitted. Ethan nodded slowly. Then fix it." Greg's breath caught in his throat. "How?" Ethan's gaze was unforgiving, but not unkind. "Figure it out," he said simply. Then he left. Greg didn't fix it overnight. He couldn't. But he started showing up. To community meetings. To seminars on racial bias. Ones he never would have bothered with before. He listened to stories from people who had suffered under men like him. And for the first time, he didn't try to justify his actions. He just listened. He volunteered at a youth center, helping teenagers who had been arrested unfairly. He sat across from young black boys who reminded him too much of Ethan and finally understood the fear they carried every time they saw a badge. And he worked, every single day, to become the man he should have been all along. Not for his career, not for his reputation, not even for Dana, but for himself. Because change doesn't happen in a single moment. Because redemption isn't given, it's earned. And Greg Millstone? He had a lot to earn. Hey, family, here at Tales of Reckoning, we bring you powerful stories that expose the truth, demand accountability, and challenge the way we see justice. What do you think? Can Greg Millstone truly change? Or did he get exactly what he deserved? Drop a comment below and tell us your thoughts. Like this video if you believe that people can grow, learn, and do better. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Because these stories, they're not just entertainment. They're a mirror. They're a wake-up call. And they're a reminder that power, without accountability, will always lead to a reckoning. Stay aware, stay strong, and until next time, demand better.